So we have a large number of traditions, customs, things which we do often without even thinking about them. They're just second nature to us. We're raised with them. They're part of our culture. Some of them are very good. Some of them are bad, and many of them are not consequential either way. Just to touch on a few, just to let you understand what we're thinking about here. We have a lot of customs and traditions around our flag, our national anthem, the Pledge of Allegiance, right? Things about standing, men taking off their hats, putting your hand over your heart, that kind of thing. We have traditions involved with what a gentleman is supposed to do in regards to a lady, right? Open a door, stand when she enters the room, pull the chair out for her, that sort of thing. We have traditions about how we greet each other in this country, in our culture. We shake hands, but always the right hand. We don't do a left hand shake. You ever think about that? Other cultures, they do something very different for a greeting. And then, of course, we have a whole host of traditions and symbolic things that are associated with weddings, rings and veils and white dresses and all of this stuff. We've got all of these traditions that we've inherited from generations past. And so what I want us to do as we think about those and consider those is think about how those are reflected in our worship, in how we do church. Where those traditions come from, those habits, and whether they are good, bad, or otherwise. And I want to start with just thinking about these two different pictures before we get into our text from 1 Corinthians. The one on the left is typical contemporary North American kind of service, praise and worship service, probably more Pentecostal than we are, more emotional, evocative than we are in our worship. And then on the right, you have something very different, something Eastern, Middle Eastern, Eastern European, much more traditional, much more solemn. But the question is one expression of the way in which we worship more fitting, more proper, more sacred than another? So consider that as we look at the specific item under view here in Paul's writing in 1 Corinthians 11. He begins 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 1 with this statement: "Follow my example as I follow the example of Christ." This is both a connection to the chapter that we just finished, where Paul was talking about various moral conundrums, right? Very difficult moral situations. He was helping the people in Corinth figure out how to navigate those. And now he's transitioning in this chapter and what will follow after this to talking about how we behave during worship at church, what church is supposed to be like, church services are supposed to be like. And so he says, "Follow me as I follow Jesus." A couple hundred years ago, Matthew Henry wrote, "We should follow no leader further than he follows Christ," which is the other side of what Paul just said here. He says, "I'm following Christ, you follow me." So what does he have to say? This is an interesting topic we're going to be looking at this morning. Not a passage that people quote, not a passage people refer to very often, but hopefully we will have something interesting to say about it. Beginning in verse 2, it says, "I praise you for remembering me in everything and for holding to the traditions just as I passed them on to you." This is an interesting insight here because we know that Paul shared with the churches that he founded in Asia Minor, in Greece. We know that he shared with them theology, right? The teachings of Jesus. What did Jesus teach? Who is Jesus? What does his death and resurrection mean for me? He taught them theology of great variety and a whole bunch of it, but he also taught them something about the manner and style of worship of God. How does a church function? What is the right way for it to look and act? And these things that he taught them, he calls them traditions here, they were no doubt influenced by first century Judaism. That's what Paul comes from, right? He was a Pharisee before he became a Christian. He was steeped in first century Jewish tradition and culture. And also, of course, it would be influenced by the culture in general, beyond just Judaism, of the ancient Near East. Why do we know that? We know that because it can't be anything else. That's the culture he was raised in. We are creatures of the environment that we belong to. And so some of the things that he had to tell them in Asia Minor and in Greece about what they should be like as a church, some of it would have fit with their pre-existing Greco-Roman cultural norms. They would have said, oh, okay, we already do that in our pagan worship, and so we'll do that. And some of it would have been very different. They would have need to adjust themselves to it. But before we continue, I want to make an important note. We, as Christians, are not like Islam in this particular sense here. We do not elevate first century culture, the first century Judeo-Christian culture that Paul was a part of. We don't elevate that and say that is the norm for how we are going to do things for all time. That culture is not what we are trying to emulate. We're trying to emulate Christ. But in Islam, 7th century Arab culture is everything. They've basically said we will freeze the culture where it was when Muhammad was here. And every kind of thing that he did, the way that he did things, those will be our norms forever. Christianity is not like that. Those aren't our norms. We're not trying to recreate first century Judeo-Christian church practice. We're not trying to sing just like them, worship just like them, dress just like them, right? We're not doing that because that's not the point at all for us. When we consider traditions, we need to stop and think, are these about propriety? Are these about what is doing fit and proper? Or are these just a reflection of the patriarchy? Are they just a reflection of the way people are doing things? How do we unravel those customs and decide whether they are good or bad or just indifferent? How do we fit them within the church? How do we separate American culture from Christian culture? That's certainly an important question if you're a foreign missionary. If you're going as an American missionary over to Asia or Africa, you want to take to them Christianity, not Americanity. It's not really a word. I just said that the wrong way. That's the whole point, though. But sometimes that's what a foreign missionary does. What the European missionaries did centuries ago, what the American missionaries sometimes do today, they take a combined package of Americanism or Europeanism with Christianity. But the point, of course, is the gospel. And so we're trying to look at that because Paul is talking about that same kind of thing in his first century context. So let's delve into the topic. What is this cultural thing that Paul passed on to them that he wants to talk about? Verse 3. But I want you to realize that the head of every man is Christ, the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. So before he makes his point, before he talks about the thing that he wants to talk about, Paul reminds them that Christ is the head of the church. We already knew that, but that's a good reminder. But he reminds them of that because he wants them to start thinking about the fact that having a hierarchy is natural. Because God is at the top of our hierarchy. God sits at the top, and we are necessarily below him in some fashion. Now, as we gather as a church, as we organize and function as a church, we could step back and say, well, how would the church work if mankind had not fallen and rebelled against God? How would our worship be if we were all living in peace and harmony with each other because none of us were sinners? Truth of the matter is, I have absolutely no idea how that would be like. How would we organize ourselves? How would we function? I have no idea because the reality is that even though we are the church, and even though we are a gathering of redeemed people who are being sanctified, we still consist only of people who remain flawed. So we as a church, in our worship, in our organization, and how we run things, have to deal with power trips and ego and resentment and people being treated unfairly. These are things which pop up from time to time. So it makes how we define our roles and our responsibilities both necessary. We have to know what they are and how we fit, because we're a bunch of fallen people, and without that we'd have chaos. But it also makes it more difficult, because we're dealing with our own flaws and our own prejudices and our own blind spots. So Paul reminds them, Christ, God, is at the top. We are below that. He's going to get into a very specific thing here that you may not have thought about too much before. He says, every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. It is the same as having her head shaved. So we as Americans read that and say, what? I'm lost. You lost me, right? What are we talking about here? It's important to remember that there's a different way to translate this. There's some translational questions with this passage. This whole passage could be translated not about coverings of head, but about hair length. You could read this as a man who prays or prophesies with long hair and a woman who prays or prophesies with short hair. We're not sure how much of this has to do with their hair length and how much of it has to do with whether they're wearing a covering. It's a hard thing for us to get into culturally as we translate this and try to understand. I just wanted to point that out to you. So we read something like this in 1 Corinthians and we say, is this a culture-bound example that has a principle behind it that we can pull out and use that principle in our own setting? Or is it a timeless command that must be and should be obeyed in every culture and in every setting? That's an important question as we read Scripture, because some things in Scripture are related to first century Judeo-Christian culture, and some of them are timeless. And Christians can and will argue about which is which. You see, in this particular context, Paul didn't have to explain to the people at the church in Corinth why having one's head covered or uncovered, as for a man or a woman, had symbolic value. He didn't have to explain that whole thing to them. They already knew that. This was something that they understood culturally. It's foreign to us, but it was normal to them. What Paul's attempting to do is to put pre-existing cultural understanding, right? Things that they already understood about the role of men and women and the proper way of doing things in their culture. He was trying to put that within the context of Christian worship. How do we adapt that to our worship? He wasn't inventing something from scratch that they wouldn't have understood. He was saying, put this properly in the context of Christian worship. You'll notice that as I go through this, I'm not really telling us how to apply this. I'm trying to get us to understand how to read it and understand it, and that's enough. We can think about the rest of it later. Paul says if a woman doesn't cover her head, she might as well have her hair cut off. But if it's a disgrace for a woman to have her hair cut off or her head shaved, then she should cover her head. Once again, we're kind of on the outside looking in, trying to understand this. Well, one aspect of Paul's line of thought here is to avoid something that was culturally relevant to them, and that is the idea of shame associated with having been accused of being an adulteress. In that cultural setting, an adulteress would have had her head shaved as a cultural shaming mechanism. And Paul is apparently trying to avoid having the Christian women who are part of the church that he is writing to, trying to have them avoid being shamed in the culture at large, being misunderstood. He didn't want them to be looked down upon for no reason. A couple of different examples from our larger culture that might help you understand, I think, where he's going with this. One is a little bit older, if you remember your American literature. Nathaniel Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter, right? The Puritans there putting that A on Hester Prynne to let everybody know that she was an adulteress. And yes, I also know, just like Hawthorne, that that is one-sided, because they were putting the A on the woman but not on the man, and obviously adultery is a two-person thing. A more modern example, and one that you might notice a little bit more easily than trying to take you back to high school when they made you read a Scarlet Letter, would be a scene from one of my favorites, Band of Brothers. If you've seen Band of Brothers, when the 101st comes into the Netherlands, they drag out a bunch of women, bunch of Dutch women, local women, and throw them down in the square and shave their heads forcibly, shaming them, because those were the women that the Dutch resistance had identified as having slept with Nazis, as having collaborated with the Nazis. And so they shamed them by shaving their heads. That's very similar to what happened 2,000 years prior that I think Paul is making reference to here. Let's keep going. Verse 7. A man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. For man did not come from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. Let me try to help us through that. What Paul is saying here is that his reasoning, his line of thought in connection with this cultural issue that he's explaining to them is, again, connected to creation itself, to the way in which God created, which is recorded for us in Genesis. Couple things to remind ourselves then from that. Genesis 1:27 says, male and female, he created them, both created in the image of God. So we're not talking about that at all here. The other part, the part of the story that Paul is talking about, is that God made man first, and then subsequently designated woman to be his quote-unquote suitable helper. Paul sees something in that order and in that role that he thinks is relevant for their understanding of how men and women in Corinth in the first century should worship God in a proper and fitting way. Of course, our task is to pull that out 2,000 years later and say, how in the 21st century in America can men and women worship God in a fitting and proper way that respects God as our Creator? Because Paul's aim here is to make sure that God, not man, receives the glory for the way in which we worship. To avoid anything that might muddle that, to avoid anything that might sow confusion about the thing that we are trying to do when we gather here. Make sure that God receives the glory. If what we are doing in our particular time and place and culture does not lend ourselves or people on the outside to conclude that we are here to worship God, then we're doing it wrong. Then we've messed something up culturally because people don't understand what we're trying to do. If you understand that, I think you get where Paul's going here. Verse 10, he says, it is for this reason that a woman ought to have authority over her own head because of the angels. Let me just say right now, this is one of those verses in Scripture that people scratch their heads over quite a bit. And not just regular people, theologians, professionals who write commentaries about the books of the Bible. They get to this and they come up with an explanation, and the next guy writes a different explanation, and the next guy writes a different explanation, because we're really not sure what Paul is talking about when he brings angels into the conversation. Because we weren't talking about angels before, and we're not talking about angels later, so we're a little confused. Maybe Paul is bringing them into the discussion as witnesses, the ones who are watching our worship, the ones who see us worship God. And so he is invoking their name as sort of an added incentive. You need to show proper respect during worship. You need to conduct yourselves in an honorable and dignified manner because the angels are watching too. I think that's what he's trying to say. Although I think we already had incentive, did we not? We already knew we needed to operate in a dignified and worthy manner when we're in the house of God. Let's continue. Paul says, nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. For as woman came from man, so also man is born of woman. But everything comes from God. Rather than be misunderstood about why he was making this whole statement about women and head covering and men and not being covered, Paul says, don't get me wrong. Think about the big picture. God's still the one that's the origin of us all. Neither men nor women are independent of each other in our worship of God. That's an important context for that, because we know that we are not independent of each other in how we live our lives, right? For the most part, most of us need that person of the opposite sex to keep us on an even keel, right? To help us get going in the right direction. We balance each other out. We understand that. Paul is saying that in worship, that in our worship, our corporate worship as a church, we need both the male and female perspective. We need the contribution of men and women. We need what both of us bring. Neither of us is independent from each other. So worship is not a male thing, and worship is not a female thing. Worship is a follower of Christ thing. And there were times in the history of the church when they segregated the genders in worship, men over here and women over there. I think they were wrong to do so. They had their own cultural reasons why that made sense to them, but I think they're quite wrong. We are designed to be together. We are designed to worship together because everything comes from God. Heading in the home stretch here, Paul says, judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not the very nature of things teach you that if a man has long hair, it's a disgrace to him, but that if a woman has long hair, it's her glory? For long hair is given to her as a covering. Of course, the first thing that jumps into my mind when reading a passage like that is what makes a man's hair long or a woman's hair short? What are we dealing with here in Paul's mind? Right? Is it on the shoulders? I know that back in the day at many Christian colleges, men had to make sure that their hair didn't touch their shoulders, or you had to go get a haircut. It was too long. All right? Is that what we're talking about? I know for some of us men, that's not really a danger, is it? We're not too worried about our hair getting out of control. You see, not every issue that we deal with as a church and as Christians is a moral issue of right and wrong. This is right and that is wrong. A lot of things are actually questions of what is fitting, what is proper, what is appropriate. As Paul said last week, what is beneficial, what builds up the church. And that's the kind of thing that we're talking about here. Do those things matter less when they're not moral questions of right and wrong? Yeah, but that doesn't mean they're unimportant. Well, are they more flexible than issues of right and wrong? Yeah, they are. Because they're related to our culture. They're related to the time in which we live. The way that you all are dressed here right now, myself included, would not have flown in this church 100 years ago. Okay? We are inappropriately dressed and we would have gotten a look. Has any of you ever gotten the look? All right, you would have gotten the look for what we are all about. Because 100 years ago, they had a different idea about how one came to church. And in different places in our world today, they have a different idea about what you're supposed to wear to church, about how you're supposed to approach worship. I'll give you this example because I'm thinking of it right now. I didn't intend to. And Nicole knows where I'm going like this. Before our church service starts, it's loud in here. And I like it because people are talking to each other. They are interacting with each other. But if you go down the streets to St. Pat's or to virtually any other Catholic church or Orthodox church, when you're sitting in the pew or you're in the sanctuary before church, you know what you're supposed to do? Be quiet. Think. Reflect. Take a moment. And one time at one church, not this one, but at one church in the past, I was shushed by a little old lady for talking before church started. And I was like, whoa, because that's not the way I was raised. So we have different ideas, different cultural, time-connected ideas about what is fitting and proper. What's the right kind of worship? We started with our eye worship, right? With the whole full band and the image, and then we had our choruses, and then we had our hymns. Are one of those more sacred than the other? Is one holier than the other? I'm going to say no, because we do all three of them. We have all of these kinds of questions, all sorts of questions like this in how we run the church. What is the right way to do things? What is the way that honors God? And that's ultimately what we're looking for. And then one final thought from Paul, one final note in this verse here. If anyone wants to be contentious about this, we have no other practice, nor do the churches of God. In the first century, in the Judeo-Christian tradition that he was a part of, this was the way they did things. So Paul was not asking for debate here. He wasn't expecting anyone to say, well, we don't want to do that, because that was the culture. That was who they were. So what do we do when we disagree with the way the church, the big church with a big C, or the little church, just a local church? What do we do when we disagree with them? They're doing something this way, and we think it should be done that way. Different translation of the Bible, different kind of music, different worship style, what? They're doing it that way, and I think it should be this way. What do I do? What's my response? There's some choices. The first thing you can do, we'll call this choice A, is to accept the way the church is doing it with humility and go along, obey, be a part of it. I call that grace and obedience. The second thing would be to quote unquote accept what the church is doing, but with grumbling and whining, and then go along with it. We'll call that obedience without the grace. The third thing would be to reject what the church is doing, but quietly. Don't make a big issue about it. We'll call that grace without the obedience. Fourth thing that you could do would be to reject what the church is doing loudly and making it an issue for everybody, because you're not happy with the way things are. We'll call that minus the obedience, minus the grace. The fifth thing you can do is to leave the church and go find one that's doing things your way. I don't like this, so I'm going to go down the street on the other side of town, and I'll keep going until I find one that's doing it my way, and then I'll be happy. And the last thing you can do is just leave and never come back. Well, I'm out of here then. I'm not going to be part of the church. Unfortunately, we in the 21st century, in American culture in particular, but also in Europe, we've seen a lot of people choose E and F. Either I'm going to go somewhere until I find that people that are just like me that do it my way, or I'm just going to leave. Neither of those are the best thing for the church. I want you to think about that. Which of those options is the healthiest thing, not for you, but for the church as a whole, for the entire body? What is the right way to handle things when you disagree with how they're being done? We're not talking about moral issues. We're talking about the way things are run. Food for thought. A couple of words of application. And one final thing before I get into that, I had another thing I forgot to say. You know what? Church practice changes over time. It does. We don't do things the way they did 2,000 years ago. We know that. And you know what? The longer we do things a certain way, the more traditional it becomes. This is a phenomenon that we have seen repeated time and time again. In particular with translations. Someone comes out with a new translation and everybody says, oh, that one's controversial. 200 years later, it's the sacred translation that everybody loves. with the music comes out. Oh, it's edgy. And then eventually, this is the thing that we've all noticed, right? They're playing in elevators the music we were rocking out to in middle school, right? Right? I heard Bon Jovi in an elevator, and I was like, oh, I'm getting old. That's not a good sign, right? They take that. That's what happens with tradition. It's different, it's exciting, but over time, it becomes what the old people do. It becomes the thing we've always done. None of that gives it more sanctity. None of that makes it more sacred. What is new is not more sacred than what is old. What is old is not more sacred than what is new. And by the way, even though we are Baptists and we don't have a liturgy, there's no book that I open up and it says, these are what we read this morning, and this is how we do it, and these are the fancy robes we wear, and the candles and the incense. Even though we don't have that stuff, we still have traditions. Now, this church could probably roll with it, but there are a lot of Baptist churches that if you tweaked the order of worship, if you changed the bulletin, you'd have some people upset with you. Why did we do that after that this week? That's not where it goes. Why, is it sacred there? No, that's not the way it works. All right, I'll leave this. We can ponder this as we go throughout the week. 3 things to walk away from. Number 1, dignity, honor, and respect have value in our corporate worship of God. These issues are important. How we approach God with dignity, honor, and respect. We all should be able to do so. Secondly, both men and women are what Paul are talking about here, but we're going to include children in this as well. Men, women, and children all have a valid and necessary function in the running of the church, in our worship, in how we do things. We need everybody's contribution. We need everybody to be a part of it. And thirdly, when we need reform, when God's Word tells us that we need to make some changes because the church is not healthy the way we're doing this or the way we're doing that, then by all means we need that. But what we don't need is contentiousness and prideful attitudes along the way.